Welcome back to the Walter Bosley channel for another fascinating episode of Killifornia with Todd Wood. Hello, Todd. How you doing?
Amazing.
Great. Well, we have a very special guest today, a guy you've been telling us about, whose database and research you've been telling us about for quite a while. So it's real exciting to have George from CAVDEF. Welcome, George.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. And tonight is one of those popular seven questions episodes. So, Todd, jump right in.
I think I will. But before we get started, don't forget if you like this episode to hit like and subscribe. And for more content, merch, and a whole bunch of extra stuff, go to walterbosley.com. I am so honored and pleased to have George here. He's probably one of the top-notch researchers in this field today. And without his website, I'd be kind of lost. His website is one of the reasons I've gotten into doing this research. And I'm honored to have him here with us tonight. So let's get started. Tonight's topic, we're going to be discussing Ted Bundy and the murders and occult stuff that was going on in the Midwest in the sort of early to mid 1970s. So George, you're doing well tonight?
Yeah, definitely. It's great to be here, and I appreciate such a lovely introduction from you.
Well, you deserve it, man, because you do great work.
Thank you.
So tell us, if can you give us like a summary of the case and a brief history of who Ted Bundy was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Ted Bundy is probably, maybe the most famous serial killer, I mean, in the country, maybe the world, that he might be one of the first people that anyone thinks of when you bring up a serial killer. And what he did is, absolutely brutal. I mean, is credited with the murders of dozens of young women and even underage girls across the country, uh, really spanning the early to mid 1970s. And he, I mean, is almost synonymous in many people's minds with a monster who has a dual personality, a double-sided nature, able to charm people into thinking that he's just a salt of the earth, regular, great, charismatic guy, seemingly successful on a path towards, really making something of himself, being a pillar of the community, and having this immense dark side where he gets off on torturing and murdering innocent people. And he comes from a background of he was born a to a mother out of wedlock. His real father's identity was never known. There have been various theories about who it was, but it's never been confirmed who his father was. And so he grew up with his mother, and originally with his mother's family, living in Philadelphia with her own parents. And then shortly after that, she moved to Tacoma, Washington, which is like, halfway between, Seattle and Olympia, which is the capital of Washington State, and grew up there. He, went into university originally, focusing in foreign language studies, the Chinese language specifically, and around the same time started to become politically involved. He was a campaign part of the Nelson Rockefeller campaign in 1968. He was also a driver and a bodyguard for Lieutenant Governor candidate Art Fletcher. He ended up going to the GOP National Convention in '68 as a delegate for Nelson Rockefeller. And around the same time, he ended up briefly going back to the East Coast, studying at Temple University, there in Pennsylvania. And then he's back in Seattle. He goes to the University of Washington again, in majoring in psychology. Around the same time, he's starting to sort of get involved with law enforcement or law enforcement adjacent entities, working for the Seattle Crisis Center, the suicide hotline, where he meets a woman from a law enforcement family who later ends up essentially profiling the murders that he is credited with committing and writing one of the definitive books about this person, Bundy. Her name is Anne Rule, so she and him are originally friends, and she later ends up becoming one of his profilers, which is interesting. But he's studying psychology. Or he ends up being working on the campaign of Washington State Governor Daniel Evans. And then after he worked on that campaign, he ends up being appointed to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee or something like that. And so he's in these very legitimate circles, seemingly. And he graduates with his psychology degree, and he then goes into law school, getting recommendations from all sorts of people, including Governor Dan Evans himself. And so he's leading this life where he appears to be very successful, almost having a possible political career upcoming, and has these connections at this high level of the Washington state government and seemingly beyond. But at the same time, he is very, seems to be involved in all sorts of brutal murders. And exactly when he began committing murders is not known. Some people speculate it began as a child. The first confirmed one is basically several murders in 1974, where young women in the Pacific Northwest began disappearing and then later turned up murdered with people on the University of Washington campus in Seattle. Also, women as far east as Ellensburg in central Washington, also some in Oregon. One young woman who was going to college in Olympia, Washington, at the Evergreen State College. This consistent pattern, at least one woman a month almost, vanishing, very few signs of what had happened. And then you had two murders on the same day occur in July of 1974 at the Lake Sammamish Park. And after that, the dark cloud seemed to move a bit eastward into Utah, where again young women began to turn up murdered, and then to Colorado, the same thing began happening in 1975. Ted Bundy ended up on people's radar throughout this time period, and police in many different jurisdictions started to compare notes, and his name kept sort of coming up as a commonality. Eventually, he was caught. He was caught essentially, on a traffic violation in '75, and that was sort of the thing that really brought him to everyone's attention. And then he ended up being caught first for a kidnapping in Utah. He was convicted of that and was serving time for that. Then he was brought forward for a murder in Colorado that he was charged with. In the middle of that proceeding, he escaped prison. He made it all the way to Florida, and then he is credited with a couple more murders there, murdering several women at the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee, and then murdering a young girl, Kimberly Leach, in Florida as well. And then he was finally caught and convicted of those crimes, and was in prison for the rest of his life until his execution.
That's fascinating. Now, tell me this, George. Was Ted Bundy a solo killer, or did he have help? Did he have accomplices?
Well, that is a good question. And if you read the official story of Bundy, you would pretty much only get the perception of him as a lone killer. But what I've done, really inspired by the work of Dave McGowan, but trying to go further than that, digging into law enforcement documentation, even trying to make contact with various people, who I could, sources of information. Uh, I would say that no, Ted Bundy, although he certainly was a monster, and I think that the murders that he's credited with, he definitely, in almost all cases, had something to do with them. I do think there's a lot of doubt as to whether he truly acted alone in many of them, or really any of them almost. And we'll get more into the occult connection, especially as it relates to the Seattle, the Pacific Northwest murders in a bit. But even beyond that, because that's its whole own subject to talk about, and that alone, if he's part of a cult, would indeed indicate the presence of accomplices. There are all sorts of other things in various crimes that Bundy is, attributed, with that don't really add up with the idea that he did it all by himself. That, for example, there's the murder of Melissa Smith in Utah, and she was the daughter of a city police chief, incidentally. But Melissa Smith, she vanishes on October 18th, 1974. And according to the autopsy that's done after she's found, it appears very clear that she was held captive for multiple days, that she wasn't just abducted and killed immediately, that she was held captive several days before she was murdered. And yet it is confirmed that Ted Bundy, on October 18th or on October 19th, the day after she disappeared, he ended up going on a hunting trip with his fiance Liz Clover's dad. So if she's being held captive for part of the time period when we know Ted Bundy was not even there to hold her captive, that almost definitively shows that somebody else had to be involved. If Bundy was involved, someone else had to be part of it too to keep her there while he was away. And another Utah crime the next month, or a series of two Utah crimes that's very relevant. On November 8th, 1974, there are two cases. First, the abduction and likely attempted murder of a young woman named Carol Duranch. She is the woman I mentioned, the attempted kidnapping, or the kidnapping that Bundy was originally convicted for. There's this abduction of Carol Duranch at that night, November 8th, 74. And then very shortly after that, there's the murder of Deborah Kent in uh, Bountiful, Utah. And if you sort of plot out the timing of that day, because allegedly what happens is Carol Duranch is abducted by Bundy, she escapes, and just get to the police. And then Bundy, immediately after the abduction of Carol Duranch, drives over to Bountiful and then ends up stalking out the school play that's going on at the high school there and ends up murdering Deborah Kent, who is there at the school. But if you look at the timing carefully, it appears pretty much impossible that Bundy or anyone could have traversed the distance between the two that quickly. That it seems like he would have had to go from Murray, Utah to Bountiful, Utah in anywhere from seemingly 30 minutes, which is already a bit of a stretch, but more likely than not, it would actually be more like 15 minutes or possibly even less than that. And we would have to be there simultaneously, just looking at the times in the official police reports and the distance that you would have had to cover, and knowing the speed limits at the time. I know people who have tried to drive that route and have confirmed that even with the higher speed limits that we have today, it would have been pretty much impossible to make it in the amount of time there. So if Bundy did abduct Carol Duranch, the person who is then seen at the school in Bountiful, who is the suspect in the murder of Deborah Kent, could not have been Ted Bundy. He might have done one, but he could not have been the same person doing both. So the fact that he is identified in both is obviously very troubling, and also a bit troubling when you consider that there was another person, a local drug dealer named Ronald Dennis Auth, Auth, who was the first sort of major suspect. He was identified very adamantly by the eyewitness, down to the way he walked and his voice, all on every physical feature, he was very adamantly identified, and yet all it took was a polygraph for the police to clear him. And of course, we recognize nowadays that polygraphs are not at all definitive in that way. But just a couple instances like that really do show that there is a substantial amount of doubt as to whether Ted Bundy really did act alone in all the crimes that he's accused of. And then when you get into the Colorado crimes, it really gets even stranger. That first of all, Ted Bundy, as I mentioned, he was on trial after he was convicted of the Carol Duranch kidnapping. He was brought to Colorado to stand trial for murder there. That was the murder of a woman named Karen Campbell, who had disappeared at a ski resort in Aspen, Colorado, and then was found bludgeoned to death a month later in the snow. And Karen Campbell, originally there was another suspect in her murder, a guy named Hugh Joseph Michael Tamos, who is interesting in his own right because Tamos, this guy, followed an oddly parallel pattern to Ted Bundy. He was in Seattle at the same time that Ted Bundy was there. So Tamos, in fact, arguably was, he was treated as a suspect in the murders there as well, just like Bundy was treated at the time as if he was a suspect there. And so then Tamos ends up a day after the first remains of the Pacific Northwest victims are found in Washington State. Hugh Joseph Michael Tamos exposes himself to the wife of a local cop, and he is arrested and gets 180 days in jail, although he's let out before that point. He then drifts to Colorado, to Aspen specifically, and gets a job at various local ski resorts there. And so the fact that he's in Seattle when Bundy's in Seattle, and then he ends up in Aspen, Colorado, where Ted Bundy is confirmed to end up as well at the same time, is a little bit odd, possibly suggesting that these two people who are moving in unison and both become suspects in the same murders as each other might actually, not just be coincidentally following each other's paths, but might have actually been sort of going in unison. But Q does Michael Tamos, he is in fact seen at the pool of the Wildwood Inn where Karen Campbell disappears from. Same inn where she disappears from, even though he never worked at the Wildwood and he worked at other inns in the resort, but not that one. And then he skips town, he picks up his last paycheck, and he immediately skips town the day after Karen Campbell's disappearance. So the
Mhm.
fact that he leaves right after is very odd. And later, investigators talk to him and they find that he has very erratic and violent behavior. He frightened several of the people who work there. So that plus him being in both places, both the Pacific Northwest at the time that those murders are happening. Then he goes to Aspen and he skips town immediately after Karen Campbell's disappearance. All that adds up to a very curious picture, but Tamos is ultimately dismissed as a suspect, and later Bundy ends up on the radar. He ends up being identified supposedly by a witness who was there at the inn, and he ends up on trial. But at the trial, the witness does not identify Ted Bundy as the person she saw at the Wildwood Inn. Instead, the witness points to the local undersheriff, Ben Myers. So the
Mm.
second in command of the sheriff's office there in Aspen, the witness points to him instead and says that he looks like the man who she saw at the inn, who is the suspect in that murder. And this undersheriff is a man named Ben Myers. Ben Myers, incidentally, has a very checkered past as the former police chief of Grand Junction, Colorado. He,
Interesting.
yeah, he was the police chief there in Grand Junction when a series of murders occurred there. Again, murders of young women who had a very troubling sort of commonalities between them. They were all involved to some degree in drugs and or were involved sexually with local police officers, were going to parties with the local cops, using drugs or trafficking drugs. And throughout 1975, these women were constantly turning up murdered. There was a woman named Linda Benson in 1970, in July of 75, who told a person who she knew, basically said, "Oh, if only you knew who the local drug traffickers were in town. They're big shots," saying that there were very prominent people in the city who were involved in the drug trade. And then she's murdered along with her child not long after that.
Mhm.
And a month later, one of her friends, Linda Miracle, along with Miracle's two sons and her friend across the street, Patricia Botham, turn up murdered. And a couple days before that, Patricia Botham was telling some of her friends that she and Linda Miracle were about to come forward with news that would shock the whole town. And it turns out, Linda Miracle was a drug informant. She dated several local police officers. She seemed to have some, again, knowledge of the secrets in the town. And so the fact that that these women, again, end up murdered very shortly after it appears that they were on the verge of exposing something is a very troubling one. And
Mhm.
so you have this police chief who's overseeing all of that. He later allegedly resigns after he is caught with secret bank accounts that have the proceeds of drug trafficking and sex trafficking in them. And the fact that he's identified instead of Ted Bundy in one of these crimes is very odd and seemingly revealing, especially when it turns out that Ted Bundy actually shows up in relation to certain things that happen under Myers. There's actually a witness who saw Ted Bundy at the scene, like right outside the apartment of Linda Benson, when on the night of her murder. This lead is seemingly never followed up on. Nothing happens with it. Bundy is never treated as a suspect in this murder, and yet it appears that he is present at the scene of a murder that occurs under the police, leadership of Ben Myers and of a woman who has some knowledge of local people involved in drug trafficking. And then in the meantime, one of Bundy's other alleged Colorado murders, a woman named Julie Cunningham, she turns out to be friends with the daughter of a police detective back in Salem, Oregon, who formerly worked with none other than Ben Myers. So you have this bizarre interconnection between Bundy's circumstances in Colorado and Ben Myers' circumstances in Grand Junction and back in Salem, where he used to be the police chief, and Myers being identified instead of Ted Bundy as at Bundy's own Colorado trial. And you have the specter of drug trafficking, that's of course very relevant in Ben Myers' case, but remember that the person who was originally identified in the Deborah Kent case instead of Bundy, this Ronald Dennis Auth guy, he himself was also a drug trafficker and a drug trafficker who was involved with smuggling, Colombian marijuana in the Caribbean, and then got apparently a slap on the wrist from a federal judge a few years after everything happened there. So seemingly someone who was protected as well. So you have this other people who are identified in crimes that are later attributed to Bundy, and you have the constant apparent connection to drug trafficking. So the possibility emerges, in my view, that some of the crimes attributed to Bundy not only were not done solely by Bundy, but might have in fact been done by a larger criminal network involved in enterprises like drug trafficking that Bundy was a part of.
Now that's fascinating. Remind me, wasn't there an Oregon serial killer who claims he was killing with Bundy?
Yeah, that was Stanley Bernson.
Ah, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and
interesting.
it is absolutely that and I've recently got the court filed on him, and yeah, it's not definitive, but he
Hmm.
claims to have had a friend who he calls T Ted or Teddy,
Hmm.
and seems to have left the impression with various fellow inmates he was with that this Teddy who he was referring to was in fact Ted Bundy, and he claims to have taken sort of snuff photos with his accomplice Teddy,
Hmm.
and may in fact have sold them. And Ted Bundy was reported to have taken photos of some of his own victims, although those photos never came to light, which might raise questions about is it possible that there was a reason why they were
Hmm.
never officially recovered if they would have revealed that he had other people who he was working with in these crimes. But yeah,
Hmm.
Bernson was another serial killer in the area who was made this claim and also had a apparently had some kind of plot to break him out of jail that involved Satanism. At least the people were leaving like satanic graffiti as part of what they were doing, and that is
Hmm.
again very curious when you consider Bundy's own apparent connections to that sort of activity.
Hmm. Let's get into the occult a little bit. What are some of the occult aspects to the murders that were going on in Washington State involving Ted Bundy and perhaps others?
Yeah, this was an angle that even at the time, homicide detectives in Seattle were seemingly taking seriously, and just some of the things that made it seem like there could be a connection. Just the fact that for many of the victims that it was just their skulls that were found, that
Hmm.
seemingly they had been decapitated, and that was all that was left, which raised questions about whether there was some kind of ritual going on, and certainly some kind of ritual would appear to be going on. Whether it was a religious ritual is another matter, but that made law enforcement suspect a potential occult connection. It was also noted, there was an informant who talked to, Ann Rule, the aforementioned Ann Rule, who was a friend of Bundy, then later became a profiler in the case. Uh, mentioned basically identified a seemingly it was like a lunar timetable for these murders that based on the phases of the moon that they were and the cycles repeating that they were able to map all of the murders that occurred in the Pacific Northwest up to that point, or the
Hmm.
disappearance of the young woman that would later be discovered to be murders. At the time, it was just known that they'd vanished; they hadn't been found yet. But they had mapped out all of the, you know, disappearances that had occurred
Hmm.
onto this timetable, and based on that pattern, they then predicted the next murder is going to occur between July 13th and July 15th.
Hmm.
And it turned out that the next murder did, in fact, occur on July 14th when those two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, were both kidnapped from Lake Sammamish.
Hmm.
So this, the fact that they could make this prediction in advance and fitting to the previous pattern of crimes, and then it turns out to be perfectly accurate in predicting a subsequent crime, in my view, suggests that this lunar timetable did in fact have validity as to why the murders were occurring when they did, and occurring in this cyclical pattern that, as I noted before, it was virtually, one girl a month who was disappearing. That did seem to be the pattern, and the fact that they were able to match it up to a lunar timetable certainly fits with the known occult practices of various groups that, do rituals based on these cyclical patterns and in fact
Yeah.
base it on astrology and on the cycles of
Hmm.
the sun and the moon. So that is another clue that suggests that there was legitimacy to the occult connection. But
Hmm.
of course, all of this is, circumstantial. Where it really starts to become more solid is various informants at different times that actually reveal these connections explicitly. That first of all, I think one of the first ones at least was a particular informant in the drug trafficking world in Seattle who was talking to the Seattle Police Department. They were revealing how they had sold hallucinogenic drugs to a local cult group that had boasted of having boasted of doing these rituals where these missing girls were hacked up and killed during these cult religious rites. That this guy was selling hallucinogenic drugs to them, and that they would use during these rituals, and in turn they were taking credit for the murders. They had given this information to the local police, and the police at the time seemed to take it seriously and considered the informant credible. This information came on June 26th, 1974. And then a few weeks later, on July 14th, 1974, the Lake
Hmm.
Sammamish murders happen. And what's interesting about that too is that up until that point, there were no definitive witnesses to any of these murders, that it was just a silent abductor, that there were reports later on of seeing, someone suspicious on campus or wherever the murders took place, but there was, no definitive lead pointing to exactly this uh, who this might have actually taken these girls. But at Lake Sammamish, occurring a couple weeks after this occult lead is being taken seriously by police, this person does it in broad daylight, very brazenly, takes two girls at once, not just one, as had been the pattern before, does it in, a crowded park where I think the police were having their annual picnic that day, so even more of a
Hmm.
bizarre decision, and openly gives their name as Ted. So almost, like they were trying to leave a trail on that occasion. And
Hmm.
conveniently, that would direct everyone's focus to think, oh, it's just one guy calling himself Ted. It's not this group that we had been looking at just a couple weeks before. So that timing is interesting, and the information from that informant is certainly valuable. And different leads along those lines continue to come in, that there was a serial killer who, Todd, you and I have
Hmm.
talked about before. Of course, we've been on William Ramsey's show to talk about it, and when we were on the Henry Lee Lucas show, we also brought him up. This man named Thomas Creech of Idaho, and Thomas Creech was, by his own account, a Satanist and also involved in this local organized crime network that was giving him contract killings to complete. So some of his murders that he was convicted for, or had at least received credit for, didn't always face trial for them, were by his own account contract killings, like a union organizer in Vegas. He also claimed to have been involved in satanic ritual at various ritual sites
Hmm.
all around the country. And one of the sites where he claimed to have done these rituals was a house in Burien, Washington, which is right
Hmm.
by the Seattle airport. He claimed to have been at this house and been involved in the ritual killings of several young women there. And so he was actually interviewed by the King County Police, in Washington State, as a suspect in these murders. Again, they more or less dismissed him, although some of their dismissals, the base for the dismissal was very bizarre. He
Hmm.
claimed, he was saying that, he talked about these sacrifices occurring in the basement of this house. There was, in fact, human blood found in this basement here, spots of human blood on the wall. There was also a pentagram found on the wall, so the idea that rituals were happening in this basement is not exactly far-fetched. It actually seems very
Hmm.
plausible.
Hmm.
Their claims involved like saying, oh, this basement was too small to commit these rituals that he was claiming happened, which I'm not sure what that's even supposed to mean. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But they
Right.
just largely dismiss Creech as well, despite him seeming to have valid, solid information about this activity taking place there in Burien. And what also makes the occult connection a little bit stronger and ties together some of these circumstances as well, and also ties back to Creech, is a man who was at the University of Washington, a professor or a teacher there named Richard Allen Miller, Dr. Richard Allen Miller. And Miller taught at the Experimental College at the University of Washington. He taught various occult related topics, including, I mean, magic and astrology and you know, parapsychology, like ESP and
Mm-hmm.
related stuff like that. He taught all these classes at the experimental college. He also, at the same time, was even by his own account, worked for U.S. Naval Intelligence and was the Northwest Regional Director of Mankind Research Unlimited, which
Hmm.
was a known intelligence front for doing parapsychology research. It was based out of D.C., but he was the director of the Northwest operations there. So doing, ESP experiments and stuff like that. So he was involved in a program that is similar to, if not identical to MK Ultra, based on what they were doing with parapsychology work, and at the same time is teaching these classes at the experimental college on occult related topics.
Hmm.
And there are various connections to Miller that show up in this case. That first of
Hmm.
all, uh, one of Ted Bundy's alleged victims, Donna Gale Manson, who has still never been found. She's assumed to be Bundy victim, but there's been no definitive proof either way, and she's never even been found. But Donna Gale Manson, who vanished on March 12th, 1974, from the Evergreen State College in Olympia, which is the state capital of Washington, she is known to have had various occult related interests herself. She had some affiliation with the local Silva mind control group, which is like a self hypnosis training group.
Hmm.
And she also is was pursuing this interest in a personal school project at Evergreen State College, and she was referred to an advisor who was none other than Richard Allen Miller. So Donna Gale Manson has this connection to Miller, which is interesting enough in its own right. However,
Hmm.
it also turns out, I've received information that some other Bundy victims also were taking classes from Miller. Linda
Hmm.
Healy, one of Bundy's first victims, also reportedly was in a class taught by Miller. Linda Healy was a student at the University
Hmm.
of Washington right there in Seattle, and she reportedly, from the information I've gotten, was in one of his classes at the experimental college there. And then you have the fact that Thomas Creech actually claimed outright that he sat in Miller's class at the University of Washington College, and one of his fellow students was none other than Ted Bundy. So Thomas Creech not only connects himself to Miller, who in turn has these connections to Bundy's own victims, and the connection to Donna Manson's right there in the police report. You can look at that online yourself, and meanwhile, he is linking himself to Miller. He's then also linking himself to Bundy, and in him that Bundy was a student of Miller's as well. And then there's a third individual who comes up in relation to that, another serial killer active in Seattle at this time, named Gary Addison Taylor, who has his own confirmed connection interest in the occult, according to Royal Oak, Michigan police files that I have gotten. And so he has this apparent connection to Miller as well. So you got these three serial killers who are interested in the occult, active in Seattle at the same time, are reportedly, by certain accounts from people such as Creech, connected to each other, and all receiving instruction from the same guy who has an occult interest and also a link to U.S. intelligence. And
Hmm.
it's not to not to say that, someone like Miller automatically is, into the cult stuff, but someone who is teaching these people this kind of practice would be, this is preparing them for uh, you know, involvement in an actual satanic cult. And so the idea that, these serial killers all receive the same kind of instruction,
Hmm.
whether they're potentially being funneled into a cult by virtue of that is a very interesting possibility. And the fact that you have this
Yeah.
constant interconnection between these killers and the victims that occurs through these occult practices and these
Hmm.
specific practitioners makes it appear very likely that there is some kind of underlying cult that Bundy and his crimes are involved with.
That's really fascinating. I was on CAVDEF doing research for this interview. Is it correct that in file 1004 were they comparing the cult activity to the 4P, or were they trying to say it was the 4P? I was kind of confused about that.
Yeah, it's unclear to me. I've tried to obtain file 1004. I can't say I've had much luck
Mm-hmm.
yet. I don't even know if it still exists, but it I had the same thought when they, of course, mentioned a satanic cannibal murder in Montana, which has to refer to none other than Stanley
Mm-hmm.
Baker. Uh, it sounded like, yeah, at minimum they were
Right.
probably, at least drawing a parallel, but it did seem possible that they could have even been indicating that their information about local activity was 4P in nature.
Right.
I
I
mean,
was just. Oh, I was. Go on. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just wondering if were they finding was it a similar situation to California, as we know that Ted Bundy attended Stanford in 1968, so he was definitely in the right place to attend any type of 4P meeting
Right.
at that time. But were they finding dead dogs in Washington State, like mutilated dogs, like they were finding in California?
That I am not sure of. I don't know if there was a pattern of dead dogs. I know that there
Mm-hmm.
was a broader pattern of, animal mutilations happening in
Mm-hmm.
the Western United States, often of cattle,
Right.
which is similarly brought up in relation to the cult groups. I do know that, I mean, we talked about Thomas Creech, who himself draw the connection to Bundy. And
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Creech describes a network of, motorcycle gangs that contract killings that's very
Mm-hmm.
analogous to the Manson case, and he even connects himself to say, a local ranch in the Los Angeles area, the McCoy Ranch in Malibu, that police had already come to suspect from their prior investigation had something to do with Manson. So the possibility that Bundy was linked to 4P is actually a very good one in my mind.
That's fascinating. That goes right along with the research I'm trying to do. Now on CAVDEF, there's a note that there's an interesting. There might be an interesting connection between Ted Bundy and the Arliss Perry murder. Is there anything to that, in your opinion? And would you kind of iterate what that was, what that connection potentially could be?
Yeah, it was sort of a note out of curiosity, and it's not that I
Mm-hmm.
necessarily think that Bundy was the killer of Arliss Perry. I don't think that, but as you said, I mean, there's the fact that Bundy attended Stanford in
Mm-hmm.
'68. He was studying Chinese language of all things, which is kind of funny when you take into account some of his political connections and
Mm-hmm.
government connections, and him even acting as a quasi spy for governor candidate Daniel Evans in
Mm-hmm.
72 while he was doing that. But yeah, he was there in Northern California in the late 60s, which is, right around the time when the Manson stuff is going on. And of course, Manson spanned both the Northern California and Southern California. He was active in both places. The process was active in both places as well. And then you have the fact that Arliss Perry was murdered with an ice pick, and Bundy was found to have an ice pick in his trunk when he was
Mm-hmm.
arrested in Utah in '75 in the traffic violation, which
Right.
then led to him being uh, you know, caught and brought up in all these other murders. That's sort of what led to the beginning of the end for him. So the
Mm-hmm.
similar weapon having that presence in California in the late 60s, starting his murder spree around the same time that the Arliss Perry murder happened, and of course, only a couple years before the Son of Sam murders happened on the other side of the country. And then, as mentioned, the likely connection of the 4P to uh, the cult that Bundy himself was part of. All this stuff just speaks to maybe a common MO. It's just all sorts of parallels that are seemingly minor on you know by themselves, but do make me wonder if there is in fact a connection between to the same organization that did
Mhm.
kill Arliss Perry.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing to me is looking at the methodology of some of these murders and everything, or I should just say the crimes. Um, it seems like what's going on here is there's a lot of like pagan rituals, but
Yeah,
it gets kind of lumped into like a Satanism is kind of used as a catch-all, and I think it's an amalgamation of both. Like it's presented as Satanism, but a lot of the traditions that we see are pagan. Does
yeah,
that make sense? Like Arliss Perry and the ice pick at the base of the skull. That's Babylonian. How they sacrifice people in ancient Babylon, but they'd use like a metal pike. So it's a modernization of that particular human sacrifice. Um, but for my final question, now Ed Sanders and Maury Terry, they in their famous books, The Family and Ultimate Evil, kind of sort of claim that there's a loose confederacy of these different occult groups working together. The network that Ted Bundy talks about before he is executed, he claims that was helping him, and of course, the person interviewing him just made the assumption that he was trying to save his own life. Is this network a loose confederation of occult groups, or is it just one nationwide cult, in your opinion?
yeah. That's another interesting question, and it almost yeah, I mean, I guess just to sort of, bring that up for, I think I did find the person claiming that Ted Bundy had made such a claim. I know it was like a comment on a forum somewhere. I don't think I was able to find whether it really, they attributed it to a book by Stephen Mitchell, The Only Living
Right.
Witness. I don't know if I actually found that in the book. This person may have mixed it up with something else. So I don't want to necessarily stake my, everything on saying this. Bundy did in fact make a claim. Whether
Right.
he admitted that or not in prison, I'm not sure. But of course, we know that people like Thomas Creech made the claim at minimum. So it's not coming out of nowhere, the idea that Bundy had helped, worked with a group of other people. This claim, as we've been establishing throughout this whole show, did come from a lot of angles. So if
Mm-hmm.
such a group exists, which I very much think it did, then yeah, to your question, is it one group or a loose connection of groups? I tend to think that it is a a confederation of different groups in the around the country, but with enough interconnections between them, at least the leadership level, that it's almost like a network of networks. That's kind of the way that I see it. Like
Mm-hmm.
the groups in, I mean, they're the group in Seattle, it would appear that there's a group in or a group in Grand Junction, Colorado, where a lot of this happens, a group in the Salt Lake City, Utah area, and a group in New York City with Son of Sam. I think
Mm-hmm.
there are many local groups of that have these similar practices, and also, as you say, not even necessarily always Satanism. It's a
Mm-hmm.
weird mixture of outright satanic worship and various types of paganism,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're talking about, I mean, Babylonian or, I mean, Celtic, all sorts of different ones come together that are and also sort of bridging that with Satanism. I think that there is a lot of, finding common interests between these groups because of their say similar sorts of ideals about, believing in personal pleasure and hedonism or using it as a front for criminal activity, all sorts of things that make these people form alliances with each other. And I think that when they start to form these alliances, and especially if they get into organized criminal activity, that's what also draws the connections between different areas. That if they're trafficking drugs to each other, and they also have these shared, religious or quasi-religious beliefs, that form the connection on that other level. that it's a social glue in various ways for this kind of criminal activity. And so I think that you have a lot of local groups around the country that are joining up with each other in certain ways through their business arrangements, through social relationships. When these people travel from one area to the other, that's part of it too. I think that Bundy went all over the country, that he went from, I mean, Seattle to Utah and then over to Florida. Ben Myers, incidentally, that police chief I mentioned, kind of followed a similar trajectory, which is a little interesting that he was the police chief in Salem, Oregon, and then he went to Grand Junction, and then he reportedly went to Florida as well. So again, people who are sort of mirroring each other in their travels across the country. And when we get people who travel like that, they are able to glue these local groups together in certain ways, or maybe they're sort of passing around members to do certain jobs, which is another allegation that came up in Maury Terry's book, that you had people like Bill Menser, for example, coming into town in New York City from his native Los Angeles to do a murder there in New York City. So people being swapped between these groups, if these groups know each other, I think is the pattern here.
I see. That's fascinating. George, thank you so much for coming on the show. I can't recommend to people who are getting into this research enough CAVDEF.org. Did I say that right, George?
Yeah, you did.
Um, and is there anywhere else we can find you, or is there anything else that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, I mean, cavdef.org is the main one, main place to find me. The wiki is has the majority of it, and if you go to just cavdef.org, there's a link to the wiki you'll immediately find. I am on Twitter, cavdef_George. I don't post a ton there anymore, just been busy with research and other things, but if I find my old posts that you can find some of the stuff I talk about. You can, like, if you search on my profile for Thomas Creech, you'll find the stuff about the Beery and Ritual House that I talked about, or if you search for Gary Addison Taylor, you'll find the police report on his own occult interests. So you can find some of my work there too. I think you'll find it interesting.
Right, right.
Great. Well, this was, as usual, full of great information. The viewers love these episodes because we get so much great information from Todd and his guests, and George. It was just outstanding. Appreciate you coming on the Walter Bosley channel, and we look forward to having you back. And I'm sure Todd will reschedule with you, and we'll have you back, and maybe for one of the longer episodes, because it seems like we just touched the surface on things. Hang out for a little bit, George, after we sign off here. And Todd, thank you again. And this has been another 7 Questions Killifornia episode, folks. And we will see you next time.